Walk with me into the gorge above the Yarmouk River in the heat of August in the year 636. Below you, a Muslim army of perhaps 20 to 25,000 men holds a narrow front against a Byzantine coalition several times its size, drawn from across the Eastern Roman world. 6 days of fighting have already passed here without a decisive result. Before this week is finished, the empire that just spent a generation clawing its way back from near total collapse against Persia will lose an entire province in less time than it takes most armies simply to march to a battlefield. What does it actually take for the empire that had just survived its worst existential crisis in centuries to lose everything east of the Mediterranean in under a week? If you want the real verified story of the 6 days that decided who ruled Syria for the next 1,000 years, subscribe now. There's more of exactly this waiting for you. To understand how thin Byzantine strength actually was by 636, you have to understand what Emperor Heraclius had just finished surviving. Barely a decade earlier, Persian armies had occupied Byzantine Egypt, Syria and Palestine, coming close enough to Constantinople itself to threaten the empire's actual survival as a state. Heraclius fought back with a series of brutal grinding campaigns deep into Persian territory, eventually forcing a Persian collapse and reclaiming everything his empire had lost. Among the treasures the Persians had carried off during their occupation of Jerusalem was the relic Christians across the empire believed to be the true cross itself, and its recovery became the single most celebrated achievement of Heraclius's entire reign. In March of 630, in a ceremony of enormous religious significance, Heraclius personally returned that relic to Jerusalem, restoring it to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in a moment widely treated as the empire's spiritual vindication after decades of near catastrophe. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most remarkable military and religious recoveries in Roman history. It also left the empire's treasury, manpower, and frontier defenses exhausted at the exact moment a completely new threat began advancing out of Arabia, and it means the same emperor who had just triumphantly restored Christianity's most sacred relic to Jerusalem would within only 7 years watch that same city pass out of Byzantine hands for good. That threat is the early Muslim conquest, moving with a speed that catches Byzantine leadership badly off guard. Syrian and Palestinian territory Heraclius had only recently reclaimed from Persia now falls city by city to Rashidun Muslim forces advancing under a series of capable commanders. Heraclius, already unwell, personally directs the response from Antioch rather than the field itself, assembling a large coalition army meant to finally check this new advance in one decisive engagement. He delegates field command to Vahan, an Armenian general, rather than lead the army himself. That coalition is larger than the force it will face, but considerably less unified. It draws together Greek imperial troops, Armenian soldiers loyal to Vahan specifically, and Arab Christian foederati under their own king, Jabala ibn al-Ayham, whose Ghassanid people had served as a Byzantine buffer against the Arabian Peninsula for generations. The Ghassanids occupy a strange in-between position in this coalition that is easy to miss if you only think of this battle as Romans against Arabs. Jabala's people are themselves Arab by language, culture and ancestry, separated from the invading Muslim armies less by blood than by faith, and by which empire had for generations paid for their loyalty. Asking them to fight and die here is asking one branch of the same broader Arab world to hold a Byzantine frontier against another. These are not simply interchangeable soldiers wearing the same uniform. They fight under different immediate leaders, hold different degrees of loyalty to a distant emperor, most of them have never personally served under, and share considerably less common cause than the size of their combined army might suggest. If the idea that an empire's worst defeats often trace back to exhaustion and internal division rather than simple battlefield failure interests you as much as it interests us, our members get more of exactly this kind of decision-by-decision breakdown, first and uncut. It's there whenever you want to go further with us. That coalition's own internal religious divisions run deeper than simple politics. Much of Syria's Christian population followed a different theological tradition, generally described as monophysite, than the Chalcedonian orthodoxy enforced from Constantinople, and generations of doctrinal dispute and occasional imperial persecution had left real friction between Syrian Christians and the distant emperor, now asking them to fight and die defending his rule. Modern historians are careful not to overstate this into the old, simpler story of Syrians cheerfully welcoming Muslim conquerors as liberators from religious oppression. The actual picture is messier and less convenient than that. What does seem reasonably well supported is more modest. This sectarian rift weakened enthusiasm for Constantinople's cause without necessarily creating active sympathy for the invaders replacing it, one more crack in a coalition that already had several. Facing that coalition is a Muslim army built from several smaller regional forces unified specifically for this confrontation, brought together under a commander whose reputation already extends well beyond Arabia, Khalid ibn al-Walid. 2 years before Yarmouk, Khalid had already built the reputation that made his presence here so valuable. Ordered to reinforce the Syrian campaign from Iraq, he led roughly 9,000 men across nearly 500 miles of largely waterless desert, a route most commanders of his era would have considered impossible for anything short of a small raiding party, let alone an army meant to fight a serious campaign at the other end of it. The march succeeded, and the reputation it built, a commander willing to attempt what looked genuinely reckless and pull it off anyway, is a large part of why the other Muslim generals at Yarmouk defer to his tactical judgment 2 years later, regardless of whatever his exact formal title happens to be at any given moment. Khalid organizes his army with a structure considerably more sophisticated than a single battle line. Dozens of smaller infantry regiments arranged to hold ground and absorb pressure, backed by a dedicated elite cavalry reserve he keeps in hand rather than commits immediately. Historians call this reserve his mobile guard, and it becomes the single most important tactical tool of the entire battle, a unit held back specifically to plug whatever section of the line looks closest to collapsing, then thrown forward the moment an actual opportunity to break the enemy appears. Exactly how much formal authority Khalid holds during this specific battle is genuinely less settled than popular retellings usually suggest. Some earlier, less reliable accounts claim Khalid had already been demoted from overall command by this point, left in charge only through the other Muslim generals' practical deference to his obvious skill. More careful modern reconstruction of the timeline places his actual removal from supreme command after Yarmouk, not before it. What both versions agree on is simpler and more important. Whatever his formal title, it is Khalid's tactical judgment that shapes how this battle is actually fought. Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, the general most sources agree held actual formal authority over the wider Syrian campaign at this point, is by every account a capable and deeply respected leader in his own right, but not primarily a battlefield tactician in Khalid's mold. He defers to Khalid's judgment on how the coming fight should actually be conducted, a decision that says as much about Abu Ubaidah's own honest self-assessment as it does about Khalid's reputation. That deference is tested directly before the battle's final day. The two armies spend weeks, by some accounts as long as 3 months, in intermittent negotiation before serious fighting fully commits either side, each probing whether the other might simply back down. Even after fighting begins, the possibility of a negotiated end does not fully disappear. On the 5th day, with the outcome still genuinely undecided, Vahan sends word seeking peace terms rather than a continued fight. Abu Ubaidah, hopeful for exactly the kind of bloodless resolution that would spare both armies further losses, is ready to accept. Khalid rejects the offer outright, convinced the Byzantine coalition is closer to breaking than Abu Ubaidah realizes, and unwilling to hand back through diplomacy what 6 days of fighting were about to decide by force instead. The battle continues into its 6th and final day because one general trusted his read of the enemy's exhaustion over his own superior's instinct for caution. Exactly how large each army actually was is even now a matter of real scholarly disagreement rather than settled record. Later Muslim chroniclers, writing generations afterward, describe a Byzantine host as large as 150,000 men facing a Muslim army a fraction of that size, a version of events that maximizes the scale of the eventual victory. Byzantine and other contemporary sources, where they survive at all for this specific engagement, suggest considerably smaller and more evenly matched numbers than the most dramatic Muslim accounts claim. Modern historians generally treat the true Byzantine force as large, certainly, and genuinely superior in raw numbers to Khalid's army, but nowhere near as lopsided as the most quoted figures suggest. Another reminder that the sources describing this battle were, almost without exception, written by the side with every reason to make its own victory look as miraculous as possible. What follows is not a single dramatic clash decided in an afternoon, but 6 days of grinding inconclusive combat, probing attacks, cavalry skirmishes, and repeated Byzantine assaults that gain ground during the day only to be pushed back by Khalid's mobile guard before nightfall. Neither side manages a clean breakthrough during this stretch. Both armies are, by the 6th day, exhausted in a way that makes whatever happens next likely to be genuinely decisive rather than another inconclusive round. If watching 6 days of exhausting, inconclusive fighting finally break in one direction interests you the way it interests us, that same kind of decision-by-decision history is exactly what our members get first, and uncut. Now feel the line begin to buckle on that 6th day. Tradition holds that the final day opens, as several of the earlier ones reportedly had, with single combat between individual champions before the wider armies fully engage. On this occasion, Abu Ubaidah himself against a Byzantine officer named Gregory. A duel Abu Ubaidah wins before the general fighting resumes in earnest. What follows is not an immediate Muslim advantage. Byzantine heavy cavalry, the armoured cataphracts that had anchored Vahan's force throughout the 6 days, drive forward with enough initial success that they push into the edge of the Muslim camp itself, close enough to taste what looks, for a brief window, like the victory 5 previous days of fighting had failed to deliver. That momentum does not hold. Overextended, flushed with what still looks like impending success, and increasingly disorganized the deeper they push, those same cataphracts leave exactly the kind of gap in the wider Byzantine formation that Khalid's mobile guard exists to exploit. Byzantine pressure on the 20th of August finally achieves what 5 previous days could not, a real breakthrough against the Muslim line, driving deep enough that panic spreads through parts of the camp behind the fighting. According to Arab sources, and Arab sources specifically, since no independent Byzantine account corroborates this detail, the women in that camp respond to their own retreating husbands with open contempt rather than fear, seizing tent poles and whatever else comes to hand, and physically driving fleeing soldiers back toward the fighting rather than letting the line collapse. It is one of the more vivid details preserved from this battle, and it is worth being honest about where it comes from. A proud, one-sided tradition rather than a neutral record, even if the underlying core, that the Muslim line came dangerously close to breaking before it held, fits the wider shape of what every source agrees actually happened that day. One figure remembered from this same desperate stretch of fighting carries a genuinely personal weight beyond the battle itself. Ikrimah, son of one of the Prophet Muhammad's most determined early enemies, had spent years fighting against the very faith he eventually converted to. At the height of the crisis, against Khalid's own direct advice not to push too deep into the enemy ranks alone, Ikrimah led a small group of companions in a ferocious charge specifically meant to hold the line at its most dangerous moment, saying openly that he had fought against the Prophet enough in his past, and would not now be the one to flinch in front of Romans. Whether he actually died in this charge at Yarmouk itself, or 2 years earlier at an earlier battle against Byzantine forces near Ajnadain, is something the sources genuinely disagree on. Either way, the story survives as it does for a reason, a man spending what remained of his life trying to outrun who he used to be. You will also often hear that a sudden sandstorm turned the battle at its most critical moment, blinding the Byzantine line and letting Khalid's forces charge through the chaos unopposed. This detail comes down to us explicitly labelled, even in the sources that repeat it, as legend rather than verified fact. It is a dramatic image. It is not something historians treat as an established tactical event, and this channel is not going to present it as one just because it makes for better television. What actually breaks the Byzantine coalition, as far as the more reliable sources agree, is a combination considerably less mystical than a convenient storm. With the Byzantine infantry fully locked in place against the Muslim centre, Khalid takes his gathered cavalry force wide around the Byzantine left flank, a manoeuvre large enough that it should have been impossible to miss, and yet Vahan's own cavalry, scattered and slow to respond after days of exhausting fighting, fails to reorganize in time to meet it. By the time Vahan recognizes what has actually happened to his flank, Khalid's horsemen are already positioned to cut off any organized retreat, and the coalition's own internal fractures finally give way under that pressure exactly when they can least afford to. Jabala ibn al-Ayham, the Ghassanid king whose Arab Christian troops had fought as part of the Byzantine line throughout the battle, defects to the Muslim side during this final collapse. Whatever precise motive drove that decision lost to us, along with most of the specific human choices made in the chaos of those final hours. Whether his defection caused the collapse or simply confirmed it, once the collapse was already underway, is not something the sources let us answer with real confidence. What is clear is that a coalition already divided by language, loyalty and command structure finally comes apart at the exact moment it could least afford to. The retreat that follows is not an orderly withdrawal, and the terrain itself is not an accident. The battlefield sits bordered by steep ravines on 3 sides, the Wadi al-Rukad to the west chief among them, Gorges deep and sheer enough that a fighting retreat across them is nearly impossible without heavy losses. Khalid had positioned his forces with those ravines at the Byzantine coalition's back from the very start of the 6 days of fighting, closing off any realistic line of retreat well before the final collapse ever began. When the Byzantine line finally breaks, soldiers pushed back toward those gorges find themselves trapped against terrain that offers no real avenue of escape at all. Cut down or driven over edges they cannot safely descend under pressure, a rout made catastrophic by a trap that had been set days before anyone in the Byzantine ranks realized they were already standing in it. Later historians, writing more than a century after the battle, record Byzantine losses in numbers as high as 70,000 dead. Those same historians are writing well after the fact, for an audience with every incentive to remember this victory as complete and overwhelming as possible, and modern scholarship treats those figures with real skepticism rather than simple acceptance. What is not in serious dispute is the outcome itself. Whatever the precise death toll, the Byzantine field army defending Syria effectively ceases to exist as an organized fighting force by the end of that 6th day. Heraclius, already back in Antioch when the news reaches him, orders an immediate, comprehensive withdrawal from Syria rather than attempting any further defense of a province his shattered army can no longer realistically hold. Popular tradition preserves a specific mournful line supposedly spoken as he departs by ship, a long farewell to Syria, a fair province now lost to an infidel's hands. Careful modern analysis of this tradition treats it as a later literary addition to the story rather than a line anyone actually recorded him saying at the time, the same category of probably invented but historically resonant quote as the ones already flagged elsewhere on this channel. Whether or not Heraclius spoke those exact words, the decision behind them was entirely real. An emperor who had just spent a decade reclaiming this exact territory from Persia now abandons it permanently, because the army he needed to hold it no longer exists. The strategic consequence of 6 days of fighting is almost impossible to overstate. Damascus falls shortly afterward. Jerusalem itself surrenders the following year. Caesarea, the last major fortified coastal city still holding out, does not fall until several years later still, but its eventual capture is by then a matter of when rather than whether. Within less than a decade of this single battle, Byzantine Egypt is gone as well, and an empire that had just finished proving it could survive total near collapse against Persia loses its entire eastern territory, permanently, to a force it had likely underestimated as a passing raiding threat rather than a genuine existential rival. Vahan himself does not survive to see how completely his defeat reshaped the map. What happened to him afterward is, fittingly for a battle already full of disputed details, itself disputed. One tradition holds that he and the remnant of his Armenian troops were hunted down and killed during their retreat toward Damascus, cut apart in the same chaos that had already consumed most of his army. A different account claims he survived the retreat only to retire, disgraced, into a monastery in the Sinai, choosing a quiet religious life over ever answering for the defeat at all. Byzantium's field commander at the empire's single worst defeat in the region either died in the wreckage of his own retreat or simply disappeared from history into a monk's cell, and no source lets us say with real confidence which. Khalid ibn al-Walid's own story does not end triumphantly, regardless of exactly when his formal demotion actually occurred. Caliph Umar removes him from any position of overall military authority not long after this campaign, reportedly less concerned with any specific failure on Khalid's part than with a simpler, more political worry that soldiers and citizens alike had begun crediting victories to Khalid's personal genius rather than to the cause and the faith he was fighting for. The single most effective commander of the entire early conquest is set aside not for losing but for winning too visibly. Jabala ibn al-Ayham's own path afterward complicates whatever clean moral you might want to draw from his defection at Yarmouk. He does not remain committed to the side he switched to at the battle's climax. Sources describe him reaching his own accommodation with the new Muslim authorities for a period afterward, only to break with them again and return to Byzantine allegiance later still, ending his life in Byzantine territory rather than under the rule he had defected toward at the moment it mattered most. It is a messier, more human ending than most retellings of this battle bother to include. A king whose loyalty at the critical hour turns out to have been exactly as situational as the alliance he abandoned to offer it. So think back to that gorge, to 6 days of fighting that finally broke on the 7th. You were never simply watching one battle between two armies. You were watching an empire that had just proven it could survive the worst crisis in its recent history discover, within a single week, that surviving one existential threat had left it with nothing left to meet the next one. Heraclius's exhausted coalition, divided in loyalty before a single sword was drawn, collapsed as much from its own internal fractures as from anything Khalid's mobile guard actually did to it. The empire that had ruled Syria for centuries lost it in less time than it takes most wars simply to properly begin. Almost nobody who mattered on that field got the ending you would expect from a story this decisive. Vahan, the losing commander, either died in the wreckage of his own retreat or vanished quietly into a monk's cell, and no source lets us know for certain which. Khalid, the general whose tactical judgment arguably won the entire battle, was set aside not long afterward by his own caliph for the specific crime of being trusted more than the cause he fought for. Jabala switched sides at the exact moment it mattered most, and then switched back again once the moment had passed, dying in the empire he had abandoned and then returned to. Even Heraclius, watching an army he could not replace, lose a province he had only just finished reclaiming from someone else entirely, may never have spoken the mournful line history remembers him by. The only thing genuinely certain in a battle this thick with disputed detail is the outcome itself. 6 days and Syria was never Roman again. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the legends checked against what the sources can actually support, the victories that trace back to an enemy's exhaustion as much as your own skill, the endings that arrived faster than anyone expected them to, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the